Hello, this is Graphic Policy Radio, a podcast at the intersection of science fiction, comics, and movements for social change. This is your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a podcast for Andor fans who want to take the stories we see on screen into the fight for a better galaxy. Today is our second episode covering the final season of Tony Gilroy's show Andor. Across these two seasons, Tony Gilroy and co. have taken us on a journey with Cassian Andor as he grows from a young man who is suffering under imperialism but focused on his family's immediate survival, not really feeling a responsibility to a broader struggle, or even believing that another world is possible, into becoming a man who's so committed and a leader in the struggle, working in solidarity with others. It's quite a growth arc. We're going to go full spoilers in covering the last half of Andor Season 2 today. If you haven't watched the show, go do it right now. And this is part 2 of a podcast series in which I'm partnering with Get Free. Get Free is a movement of Gen Z and millennials working for repair, real equality, and true freedom from white supremacy. They have pods across the U.S., organizing young people across race and place towards that goal. And together, we've launched Project Fulcrum. Fulcrum is a title in Star Wars used for folks who gather intelligence and recruit new members to the rebellion against the Empire. As Project Fulcrum, we're bringing the themes of Star Wars into a lively online conversation to help fans become organizers. Hundreds of fans have signed up to receive our Nemix weekly manifestos that feature calls to action to fight fascism and fight for freedom and equality in the real world. And we are doing deep analysis of the series and pointing you at some of the other cool sources of Star Wars videos and reviews that can also help inform your thinking about the series. And that's all in Nemec's weekly manifesto, because I'm sure you probably watched Andor and thought I would love to get an actual Nemec's manifesto. So yes, you can sign up for Nemec's manifesto, and then you can hang out with us in a Discord where we're talking about Andor and other Star Wars stories. We want to recruit you. Come hang out with us. Just sign up on getfreetogether.org/project-fulcrum. That's getfreetogether.org/project-fulcrum, FULCRUM. The episode that we recorded covering the first half of Andor Season 2, you can go listen to on our Graphic Policy. Do that first, because we're not going to redo a retread. We're going to focus on the second half here. And joining me today again is the visionary behind Project Fulcrum. Anthony Vidal Torres is the communications director for Get Free. He's a messaging specialist, political strategist, and organizer originally from Long Island, New York, who has supported winning progressive campaigns across the U.S. and abroad. He's been an avid Star Wars fan as long as he can remember, from playing Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2 with his brother to watching Ahsoka grow into the leader we know and love. The stories from a galaxy far, far away are a key reason why Anthony believes in the power of hope, the power of people, and the power of action to change our reality. Welcome back, Anthony.
Thanks so much for having me, Alana. Excited to be here for part 2.
And you got to see Tony Gilroy and Stephen Colbert last night before watching episode 10, I believe. Anything to report back from that experience?
Yeah, not only that, but Diego Luna showed up as a surprise.
What?
And we got to see episode 10, the first episode in this last finale arc, before everyone else. So we're going to get into that. But if you've seen that episode and you're listening to this podcast, it was a surreal experience to be that stressed out in a room full of other Andor fans.
Oh, yeah. No, my heart rate monitor, like thingy, my Fitbit, whatever, was like losing its mind. It was like, you're on the elliptical right now. I'm like, no. And joining me is somebody who folks might remember from my coverage of Andor Season 1. He is my other guest expert, Charles Lencher. He's a guest with a history in rebellions and resistance. Maybe not from a galaxy far, far away, but raised in Israel, where he resisted the occupation and even spent time in prison there for refusing to be a soldier. Since he's been involved in movements, again, including the anti-corporate globalization movement of the 90s, stopping the Iraq War after that, Occupy Wall Street, and the historic rise of Bernie Sanders and democratic socialism. He's a big nerd about history of revolutions, but also, unlike myself and my other guest, he was actually in the theater to see Star Wars, the original film, in 1977. So welcome back to the show, Charles.
Thank you for letting old people participate in your wonderful podcast. That's very nice.
Well, I actually got so much out of the historical context you shared with us last time that I'm like, I need you to be here now.
I was also going to chime in that where Anthony has a record of successful campaigns, I have a very long track record of those that have lost. Kind of jealous.
Which I think is invaluable. Like, so much of what we see this season is people failing until they win, you know?
Yeah.
I wanna jump right in talking about the biggest story that we have not been able to cover fully yet. We didn't even really get to talk about the Gorman massacre we didn't cover a Gorman massacre because it hadn't happened yet last time, but we talked less about the Gorman story at all last time because I just knew that that was gonna come to a head after we recorded. So now is our really a good time to go big into this. And from its inceptions with, strategic debates that we did discuss between Cassian and Luthen about how and when to get involved in the uprising or not. We also have a story in which we saw the empire specifically going to try to provoke violent response in the population for the purposes of having an excuse to have a crackdown, which is also very accurate to things that have happened in the real life. And certainly one of the things on top of my list thinking about this was COINTELPRO. And if anybody wants to talk about that now, this is your time.
Where to begin? I was thinking about how the arc of Gorman, the theme is the nature of leadership. And I was watching the younger, less experienced rebels on Gorman, both the moderate side that is very nervous about militant action, as well as the young hotheads. They don't know what they don't know. And the way that you achieve leadership in social situations is by projecting a supreme confidence that you truly understand what's going on. And yet, both of those wings of the Gorman, movement do not understand what is going on. And I think it's really interesting for people in movements who occupy, so many different roles. What does it mean to really internalize that you do not know everything? And how do you hold that while knowing that to build a movement, you still have to show confidence in the direction that you're pointing at? To be more explicit, I'm thinking about how some folks who see themselves as more militant and revolutionary will denounce folks who focus on lobbying or elections. And some folks who have
Yeah.
access to insider conversations of movement leaders will feel that the followers, the people that you invite to show up for events, ought never to be listened to with the same level of attention as other people in the room with you when you go on those special retreats and table Zoom calls. And it's a real challenge to sit with yourself split in two, recognizing that actually those leader tables, there's a lot they don't understand or know either, but they're usually better at projecting confidence in how things are, which makes them much more dangerous.
There was so much debate from Ryland, who's the community leader and the Gorman Front, and sort of seeing him and his daughter and, like, having them really try to hash out those questions.
I'll just jump in again and say this is mirrored a bit in the Palestine solidarity movement that students on campuses were leading. And I
Mm.
made the foolish mistake of saying out loud what I thought, which is they failed to contemplate how severe the consequences might be. And that failure has resulted in a diminishment of that movement as many students who support the goals of the movement have been participating less often because they were not really prepared to pay the costs and they weren't really told what those costs might be by the folks in positions of leadership. And the consequence of that is that the current wave of protests is less numerous, but has a much more militant leadership that's more uncompromising but not as attractive for other students to join. And that is, in fact, a very natural progression of left movements in the world.
One of the things from that really stuck with me was the assumption that the young rebels had that the older man who was sort of the neighborhood guy who was yelling at the community meeting and, like, really wanted to be heard, when he came and stumbled in on their operation, like, them trying to keep him out of it was one of the things that accidentally led to Cinta's death. And the thing is, like, when that crisis happened, he stepped right in to help and rescue her, which I thought was an interesting moment of being like, sometimes the level of fear you have of like talking with outsiders is actually harmful versus bringing them in with you.
Uh, I really resonate with Charles, what you said earlier about this arc, and I would even say this whole show being a reflection on leadership and the dangers, the threats, but also the important values of leadership and how we need to nurture people and how we need to respect the bravery it takes for people to step into their competence and leadership. And what you were just talking about, Alana, yeah, it's we need our movements to be accessible. We need to be movements that grow at the scale that we need to win. Because for us, people power is the main fuel for us to succeed when we have regimes that have a much greater hold on money, on political power, and in many cases start out with a lot more control over the narrative. And so in these episodes and in those scenes, especially on Gorman, yeah, that it's a heartbreaking moment because you can see that the rebels, by being inherently distrustful of others, they actually create barriers through which they can get more leaders who can provide things that the movement doesn't yet have.
Mhm.
And in addition, by being distrustful, they actually weaken themselves and open themselves up to threats that wouldn't be there if they had the numbers and if they had the scale what they needed. So yeah, it's a really heartbreaking moment. And but I am really glad later on when we do see that he's now a part of the
Yeah.
rebellion. He's a part of the covert, that they learned from that horrific mistake.
Yeah, yeah, and that folks from that whole crew had still stuck through. I do wanna just go back for listeners who are unfamiliar with COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO is abbreviated from Counterintelligence Program, was a program run by the FBI from the late '50s through the early I guess through '71, that specifically surveilled, discredited, and undermined civil rights movements by trying to interfere and manipulate what activists were doing, and we're talking about, like, literally spying on Martin Luther King, trying to get him to commit suicide. Like, the levels of evil that were being done by the FBI to undermine perfectly legal, peaceful even, movements for social change had a real market effect on the world, and the reason any of this was exposed was through activists themselves, but the impact of having the federal government have basically spies trying to undermine peaceful movements in America is a true blight on our social history, and that was the first thing that came to mind for me when we saw the ISB talking about how they can influence the actual authentic worries of the people of Gorman to try to manipulate them so that they will do the most extreme response possible and make everybody look bad and give the empire an excuse to come in and kill a lot of people to retaliate for what's happening. And I was also noting how much the media covering Gorman prior to the immediate massacre and right after were saying that all of the people on Gore who were talking about how fucked up the Imperials were just outside agitators that didn't represent what the actual people of Gorman think, trying to other activists, because activists didn't count as real Gormans. When it's like literally the only person on there who's not really Gorman, who's on there trying to push for change, is Cyril Karn, who you placed there. Anyway,
Well, excited to hear what Charles has to say also, since apparently he may have been around during Pro time. At the start of this, I was like, we're all same generation. But what I would add to that is, yeah, we know from our own history in the US and many other contexts that the Imperials, authoritarians, all of the MAGA regime today and their predecessors, they understand that controlling information and shaping public opinion is necessary for justifying, enforcing, and normalizing tyranny. So you mentioned, Alana, the deliberate othering and scapegoating of groups as well. And we see that through their attempts to divide and infiltrate the movement, but we also see that through their propagandist press that we see on Gorman and on Coruscant. And when regimes try to create pretexts and justifications for violence like this, And we even saw this in many ways. In recent years, we've seen the MAGA faction try to actually stoke violence and actually create their own pretext for crackdowns. When those moments happen, it's imperative for us to expose the deeper lie at the core of the opposition strategy, which is the deeper lie that one's safety must come at the expense of someone else's.
Mm.
And in addition to that, we also just have to have a real assessment of what our opponent's motivations and the even though we don't have all the information, as Charles mentioned earlier, at least understand like what is the general strategy that the regime in this instance is going to use to hold on to power. We talked about in one of our recent manifestos or the last podcast about how, just exposing the truth alone that the garrison was going to be on Gorman wasn't going to be enough to spark the broader revolution that the Gormans wanted because the empire had already controlled a narrative that said the galaxy needs more troops, more soldiers, more guns, more security. And so they're revealing that there's a garrison there. Most people probably would have reacted like, yeah, maybe I don't love it, but I actually already expected that there were a million Star Destroyers around us at any moment. And so instead, what we see a deeper exposure of the truth is what we see from Mon Mothma later on and from other rebels in her
Mm.
speech. And we'll talk about that more later, of course, but where she really pulls out what is the actual motivations and what is the end game from the emperor and the empire that undergirds all of their actions rather than just trying to fight on the opposition's terms.
Yes. Yes to everything. And one of the things about the way the left remembers COINTELPRO is that it was all a bunch of nefarious things that the FBI and city level red squads and so on were doing to poor innocent activists. And what's missed when you actually go into the details, they were almost always doing what was already happening, but amplifying the folks that were sowing division, that were race baiting was a big one. The FBI learned how to race bait from one left group to another and internally. Or
Mm.
they would polarize along the lines of, if you were really serious, you'd support my crazy idea X instead of your weak ass moderate idea Y. So the existence of those things in our own movement is what gives the blueprint to the opposition for what to do against us. And it's very hard to persuade. I'm gonna be slightly pejorative and say some of the younger hotheads or the folks who are driven by a feeling of, I have a strong community that's backing me in my very strong dopamine and cortisol release. That's what it feels like when I'm denouncing someone else or telling people to join me in doing something crazy. Very difficult for someone to say, hold on, why don't we just sit there and not do anything before we jump into action so we have time to process in a less emotional way? And that is the last thing anyone wants to hear, as anyone who is at Occupy can attest. It is the challenge of movements in real time, is to find the balance between courageous initiative that makes sense and a willingness to say, hold on, it might be better to wait and think harder before we jump forward. And I'm thinking about that young man in the Gorman Resistance who brought a blaster to the battle after being told numerous times not to do it. He had not been trained sufficiently. He had not been, shall we say, blooded by past battles to understand the significance of military level discipline when you're doing military level actions. And if I was sort of in leadership in that show, what I would have understood is that precisely because they're new, there's no way you can expect that level of discipline.
Mm.
It would have been smarter to literally search them before letting them join the action. It's like when you're with, and I hate that this sounds so patronizing and old manish, but like if you're corralling middle schoolers, they're going to try and sneak in crappy stuff on the school trip. So don't act as if you just telling them the consequences will be bad is going to work. Search their goddamn bags.
Point taken. So many folks have been talking about the specific sequence within the massacre, folks really coming together, singing and joining together in song, like of their national song, how haunting and well crafted that moment was in the series. And the fact that ultimately, like, we saw the minute I saw people marching down the narrow streets towards the Central Corridor, I was just like triggered in every memory I have of being at a protest in which people walked right into a kettling situation, meaning large crowds of people directed into a small controlled area. And I was like, this show exists in a heightened reality where all kinds of shit that is not in play in our world is going down. But like they were very hung up on the need to occupy a particular space. And their desire to occupy that particular space was not rooted in a real strategy for why they had to be in that space. It was rooted in an emotional need. And by prioritizing being in that square, they actually put everybody in danger. I think now actually about the upcoming rallies that are happening. Trump is doing his like glorious leader march day in June, where we're all like, they're gonna like literally go straight up China, tanks in the streets, saluting your leader shit in DC. And you know where there isn't a rally? There isn't a rally in DC. There's rallies in communities all over the country that people are doing on their own. And I'm like, like for the No Kings protest, like they're basically doing the opposite of marching right into the town square to get shot at.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about hope in this show, and hope is super critical for movements to win. But hope is a plan instead of just a reaction. And what we see in those scenes on Gorman is an immediate reaction to what the Imperials are doing. And even though they're being told, hey, they're setting up barricades, hey, they're setting up what obviously looks like a trap in that square. But as Charles mentioned, it was such an emotionally evocative trigger for so many people there. And in addition to training and training on how to effectively protest or how to avoid some of those traps in an action, I think what you were saying too, Alana, around strategy is so important about, are we taking actions, which are so important to changing the common sense? Are we taking actions on our terms or theirs? Are we the ones driving forth the story, or are we just reacting and on the back foot to whatever our opponents do? And so I think it's really smart that on June 14th, while the regime is trying to parade themselves and encase themselves in metal and camouflage and trying to project strength that they don't have, that we don't enter into their realm of control.
Mhm.
Instead, we try to take the mic by creating other centers of gravity in other places of power, like in our communities, or taking actions in places like DC on a different day where we can catch them off guard, which I hope is happening. And maybe I have some insight into that. But
Looking forward to hearing.
Yeah, two things are coming up for me, and I hope I don't veer too much away from the show itself. One was that the whole essence of nonviolent direct action as a strategic philosophy rests on the idea that the people inflicting violence can undergo change, can be influenced. The empire was not in that position. Unbeknownst to the protesters, the empire was hoping to escalate in the direction of
Right.
atrocity for its own internal logic, which, by the way, Luthien understood very well. Luthien was under no illusion what would happen, so it's not as
Yeah.
though other smart people couldn't have figured that out as well from contexts in the square at that time. And it reminded me of the Palestinian Great March of Return, which is when thousands of Palestinians, clearly unarmed, were marching towards the fence of Gaza in 2018 to symbolize and protest the siege around Gaza and try and get the world's attention. Didn't work. Israel shot, thousands of those people. Tons of people lost limbs. Hundreds, forget the number, 300 or something, were literally shot outright. Remember, this is being done by snipers from behind guarded position. This is not a out of control, fearful troop scenario in any way. So you have to understand the logic of the enemy. And one of the places where I see a weakness in a lot of progressive and leftist activities is that people find it really off-putting to think like the enemy, to literally imagine themselves as if they were on the other side and what they would do. And as Sun Tzu will tell you, that's what you have to do to be a leader of your team, is to think in that way. The
Mm-hmm.
second thing is, from the perspective of someone who's trained and participated in mass nonviolent direct action, the Gormanites were unprepared. Where was the training that said that as soon as you hear shots ring out, you have to get on the ground? Instead of doing that, they ran around like chickens with their heads cut off. Where was the injunction that those who wanted to use violence be strictly separated from those that did not? Instead, the violent militants, and I won't say they have no point for what they were trying to do, but to the extent that they did, their willingness to hide behind the unarmed people who weren't expecting it, well, that's not okay. And
Yeah.
while people justify it in various ways, like I would say that that marks you as untrustworthy from a movement perspective if you ever do that sort
Mm-hmm.
of thing. And then finally, notice that the empire was not willing to rely on the escalation of tension in and of itself. They had a sniper ready to shoot
Yes.
their own troops. And that
Mm-hmm.
sniper, his success depended on the chaos that would be caused. But a very well trained movement that knew to sit down, raise their arms, not move, to be still and not use their body in any way that could be misconstrued, that would have made it much more difficult for those cameras to capture the scene and then edit it in a way that made it seem as though the Gormanites instigated violence. And I think for a lot of people being drawn into the resistance, in our time, understanding the significance of these rules and trainings and so on, I feel, well, I just want to go after the enemy. It's like, hold on, you really need to be prepared for a lot of awful things that you might not be considering yet.
Speaking of thinking like the enemy, one of the things that Andor does so effectively is everything it's developing with Cyril Karn. And in season 1, I think most people's takeaway when watching him was like, "Oh, look at that loser try hard. We're nothing like him. To hell with him." And by really going into which I thought was a mistake because, like, the more I think people saw themselves as completely different from him, the less they had to learn from the series. And I think that in season 2, when we really get to delve into his story more and also into, like, how he's being manipulated, I hope that I mean, it's totally A-okay that he got killed, like, this is fine, but, like, I want folks to understand that, like, the reaction that he's having is very normal and that a lot of people he repeats the propaganda about Gorn right back until he's living in Gorn and seeing, like, "Oh, these are actually real people." And when he's given a moment to try to stop violence, because remember, he thinks he's there to get Cassian, right? He doesn't think he's there to get everybody on Gorman killed. And as right when he has his the "Are we the baddies?" moment where he realizes that, like, he has participated in creating a mass slaughter of just regular peaceful people, and he starts to question, have I been enabling fascism all this time? And it's bad. Yes, yes, it is. Whereas he thought he thought he was promoting, like, safety and law and order in a way that would serve people. He was wrong, but that's what he thought. He's beginning to have his moment of seeing the light, and right as he does, he sees Cassian, and he forgets everything he just learned, and because in his mind, Cassian is a criminal outlaw who still needs to be stopped at all costs. He doesn't take it the added step to question, "I was wrong about Gorman and the Empire. Maybe I'm wrong about Cassian too." And if he had had a moment more reflection, which I see why he did it given it's the middle of a street fight, he might not have ended up getting shot. Like, he might have actually like, maybe in some reality, he figured his shit out and was able to be someone who makes sure that no munitions go missing on Yavin, But, like, he couldn't unlearn his indoctrination fast enough.
Yeah, it was too little time, too late for Cyril. And yeah, who hasn't been Cyril, getting into a fetal position on their bed or wanting to, but not able at any moment. So I definitely feel for Cyril, especially in season 2, especially as someone who also at one point in my life thought that it was important to just follow the rules for rules' sake. That's who Cyril is in my mind. He's this person who's like, I'm a rule follower and I believe in rules. And then at the very end, he starts to realize, oh, wait, maybe rules need to conform to our values, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And so I think that his story, even though it came too late for him, I think it just tells us how important it is to be open to people's defections because if our movements are going to be successful, we're actually trying to move people to our side. We're trying to change people's minds and behaviors. And so we have to be ready then to accept them, which unfortunately, that's a lesson that many on the left, many movements forget when the moment comes.
I love the character. I think he's one of the best written bad characters that I've seen in a long time, and I'm gonna take a minute to explain why. First of all, to me, it's very obvious that he's autistic, and that the rule following that Anthony was pointing at, yes, it's an emphasis on rule following, but it's also a lack of social communication skills. It's precisely those social communication skills that many, not all autistic people have as like one of the most prominent characteristics. So he's always trying to find a way to say, my boss might disagree, the other people around me might disagree, but I know what the rules say. And he's not open to changing the interpretation of these things based on the people around him. While there are many situations where you would want someone to be like that, maybe if you're a judge in a courtroom, there's lots of other places where that's going to harm you. The second thing is, in the interactions with his mother, we all recognize that mother is overbearing, and it's very easy to like, see that and condemn her. But I want to pinpoint exactly what's happening. She is destroying his sense of selfhood, which is an important developmental milestone for young people growing up. And when you destroy someone's selfhood by being a caregiver who constantly judges and evaluates and criticizes, you end up with an adult whose locus of control is no longer in the self, but is externally
Mhm.
derived. So, why is he so focused on the rules? Because his sense of self has been stripped away from him in his early childhood. So, he
Yeah.
goes through life clinging to the external locus of control from which he derives his sense of self. The empire exists in order to find people like that and say, we will fill in that void inside of you. We warmly embrace people like you because we're totally prepared to take on the responsibility of us being the source of your identity. One last tiny thing, which is it's so easy to make this about right-wing authoritarianism and miss the fact that the same process works on fellow leftists and progressives as well.
I mean, when the show revealed that Dedra literally grew up in a child prison because her parents were quote criminals, that was one of the best reveals of the series because you're like, okay, this is the only framework you have for looking how society is supposed to function. The prison state is your family, and everything makes so much sense there. And I mean, speaking of like people, I a lot of there was a fan theory that Luthen Wad had been like a former Jedi, and I'm like, no, no, no. He was definitely an Imperial. Felt very edified to see, yes, he was like a former Imperial who had realized that what they were doing was atrocious. And we'll talk more about that episode in a bit, but because I kind of want to finish on there. But let's talk about the lineage of the Line rebellions are built on hope from the Gorman hotel concierge, Anthony.
Yeah, we love that that line just came from our everyday member of the rebellion, the hotel concierge, the cute guy behind the counter. And now we know the full story, right? So he says that to Cassian in that moment. And a part of me really hopes that hotel concierge person made it through. But he passes it on to Cassian, who's also struggling at that moment, right? Like with his leadership, his belief. And then Cassian passes that on in Rogue One to Jyn Erso. And Jyn Erso then says it in the room of the leadership of the Rebel Alliance on Yavin. And apparently a rebel journalist who was in that room recognized a good talking point and a good line to broadcast in the battle of the story and broadcast that line. Maybe that's the same rebel journalist who blasted Nemec's manifesto across the HoloNet.
I am so hoping that MX Manifesto was blasted through the HoloNet, but part of me thought it was just like that Partagas got access to it when they raided Luthen's hideout, and he was listening to it as an individual and kind of just like reflecting on how the general message of revolution had was cropping up. But I hope you're right because, like, the world deserves to hear Nemec's manifesto. I'm just sort of like, "Oh, wouldn't that be awesome?" But I don't actually know that he was here, that it was, like, an actual broadcast. I don't know.
Right, right. It works either way. But yeah, now we know that that mantra rebellion's built on hope, that the rebel journalists spread that across the galaxy around the time of Rogue One and A New Hope to galvanize more people to join the movement. One other thing I just learned though, last night at this Tony Gilroy event is Stephen Colbert asked Tony Gilroy about that line and like how he integrated it in the show. And Tony Gilroy, who's a really funny guy, and maybe was a little drunk on stage, honestly, in his own words. But he goes, so his son, Tony Gilroy's son, worked on the show with him. And apparently, as they were making Andor, his son went to go rewatch Rogue One and came back to his father's office, Tony Gilroy's, and said, "So what's the backstory to Rebellions Are Built on Hope?" And Tony Gilroy goes, "Well, it's just a thing, right? Like everyone knows that rebellions and movements are built on hope, right?" And his son's like, "No, you gotta like build the story that like we have to convince people that that's true." And so then Tony Gilroy apparently wrote that completely into the show, and they were writing the Gorman episodes at that time, and so integrated it into that arc.
Oh, how wonderful. That's wonderful.
I was thinking in relation to the Hope story is that Luthien is a good example of someone who understands that revolutions are built on hope, hope that he himself does not actually have. He is a pure manipulator. He wants hope to be deployed like a weapon by his side against the other. He is not at all interested in emotional tinges to rational thinking. And there is a really interesting parallel in the world of modern movements. You saw Obama take that sentiment of hope and use it towards neoliberal ends. It is a difficult task to convince sort of everyday people to simultaneously agree that hope is important and that they should have it, and
Mm.
simultaneously understand how it is so often a tool for the manipulation of the masses. And it's one of those things where like, well, if I'm the one manipulating the masses, then it's good. But if the opposition is the one that's manipulating the masses, then it's bad. But that's not really a division because they're doing the exact same thing.
Hmm. I want to talk, speaking of messaging, about Mon Mothma's speech and both like the contents of as well as the narrative that gets built around it. We'll talk about the contents of first. Anthony, do you want to talk about our girl Mon Mothma?
Yeah, and maybe we can splice in her speech. I could listen to that speech over and over again. I mean, Mon Mothma's remarks could have been in our own US Senate, verbatim practically, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
The crucial part of this that so many folks I've seen sharing Mon Mothma's speech on social media and stuff is around a couple moments where she lifts up, of course, and names what happened on Gorman, a genocide. And then she also names an actor and a strategy that's going on.
Hmm.
She names how the death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil, and how it's a deliberate strategy where the monsters who can be the loudest, and we can think of who those monsters are in our own context, some really rich white guys, how those monsters are ultimately people we help create by our enabling or by not confronting them or just by fueling their rise in the first place. And finally, she names the villain, she names the unthinkable, the unnameable in that
Hmm.
space, which is calling that monster Emperor Palpatine and really isolating the small them from the rest of the people who she knows need, we're gonna need, that she's gonna need, and the rebels are gonna need in the galaxy to defect from the Empire, defect and defy and refuse to comply with their rule. So it's an amazing speech, and yeah, I want more Mon Mothmas, Padme Amidala's, Bail Organa's in our own leadership in our country right now.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that this is a series that understands the importance of that because I think a lot of them downplay the value of people who don't wield a sword. And this is not a series that does that. In fact, it foregrounds and values the fact that it makes the delivering of a speech a moment of heroism is, like, so far beyond what other series do. Like, to say that, like, the value of speech actually does matter and have significance. And I love how Get Free pointed out in the memes they shared last week of how many individual, not particularly major characters contributed in small ways towards Mon Mothma being able to deliver the speech, including those clerks who are, like, just aides in the Senate who are like, "Oh, I don't know, we can't get in there. Sorry, locks broke," you know? That was oh, like, Tony put that on screen for a reason, like, he wanted to show many people make that possible.
Well, I was thinking about the drama of her speech. Like, it was really well done as reality if we were in that universe and as film. She was using an emotional moment that Luthien actively worked towards.
Mm.
She was mourning the deaths of people that Luthien threw into the fire, and yet she and Luthien are completely on the same side. And the way that this show creates dilemmas that don't really have neat solutions is one of the ways in which it isn't always a good way to say, and just like in the show, this activism piece that I want you to do, X, Y, Z. I think that the brilliance of the show is in developing compassion and a complex understanding of systems, as opposed to a lot of other resistance style shows like The Hunger Games or Harry Potter, where it's very easy just to go, rah, 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 we're going to get rid of the guy who can't be named or whatever. This one is forcing us to confront that even the most good things in the universe, they are paved with a lot of morally ambiguous situations. And if you want to be an agent of change, you can't avoid them. There is no such thing as staying out of that. Even Mon Mothma is complicit in what happened in Gondor.
One of the things that was interesting in this series is Star Wars Rebels, really and wonderful animated show for all ages, but initially really intended for young people about building a rebel cell, in the Star Wars universe, had a particular version of the story of how Mon Mothma reached Yavin Base that we saw on screen, and the Andor series had offered sort of another portion of it that we hadn't seen before, and they talk about directly how, like, there was a narrative that the rebellion wanted to build in terms of the storytelling of their movement that was at odds with the reality of how it came to be. I don't know if you wanna reflect on that, Anthony.
We finally see the rebellion start to craft their own narrative. And I love the connection that was made between Andor and Star Wars Rebels because we hear some one of the rebel operatives say, we need there to be another part of the story. Because, let's just sit with the original thing that happens here, right? One, Mon Mothma giving this speech, and it was live on the HoloNet, was cut off right at the end. Like, that alone is brilliant. But what happens after is not a great story out that a one that the Empire can easily manipulate, right? She's rescued by a would-be assassin who then kills several people in the Senate on their way out and they disappear. Instead, what they construct with Rebels is they connect her with Gold Squadron, I believe.
Yeah.
And that's eventually our heroes in Rebels that include a Jedi like Kanan and Ezra. And that story, even though that, if you've watched those episodes, and sorry for the spoilers, shit hits the fan because the Empire does catch up to them actually and almost captures them. But the goal of that is, in addition to the theater that they're creating, Mon Mothma also is able to give a second speech in that part of the
Mm.
galaxy. I think it's above Dantooine, which is a planet, I think that was another early planet trying to rebel and fight for freedom. She's able to actually broadcast through whatever means the rebellion has in the HoloNet, a second speech where she calls for rebellion. So the first speech in the Senate is like a part one, where she, in the center of power, she condemns the emperor. In the second speech, she focuses on a call to action, what the
Mm.
galaxy, the beings of the galaxy need to do next. And so, yeah, I get it. If I were the rebels, I would have been for this plan.
Yeah, yeah. I also just think, like, in the meta sense, figuring out a way to tell an adult story that is complementary to the all ages version, like, I think it thread that needle well, and I think everybody can be, happy with that balance. And something that also stems from the moments around Mon Mothma's escape is, Luthen himself says, "We've all been bent by secrecy." And that really foreshadows what we see covered through the rest of the end of the series about distrust and paranoia among the allies, among the rebels. From there they start debating, can we trust Cassian's info? That fear is one of the barriers that keeps Clea from, like, leaving their apartment building as quickly as she might have, and just sort of the problems of that living in fear of each other and the distrust of each other happening in there.
But that fear is balanced out by those scenes we see of, they're playing some kind of board game or gambling game
Yeah,
with
they
chits.
have, like, it's like space mahjong
So
is what
yeah,
we have information about.
that's great. The camaraderie developed at that level is a crucial tool and a
Mhm.
reminder that, every military person knows that the soldiers in the foxhole are not fighting for their flag, they're fighting for the person next to them. And again, that is something that movements deliberately cultivate because it's powerful.
I mean, that's why I was so thankful that we got to see Clea make it to Yavin, make it to the promised land, as it were, and having her just go and see people at work in the work of creating and building the rebellion in a way that's collective rather than hidden, I think is really healing for her. I love that she got to sit at the table with Vel and talk with her again and sort of, like, share their survivorship together, but you could just see how moved she was, like, she was scared to go into the office because she thought everybody was gonna judge her as because she was, like, Luthen's daughter and, "Oh, everybody hates him," and, like, yeah, clearly they didn't fully trust him, and that was a systemic problem, but people were not there to be like, you know, "Because you came from working with him, we dislike you, we don't wanna have you." It was like, no, people were ready to embrace her and build community with her and heal.
The vibe in those scenes was like an old-timey Earth First gathering in the wilderness, which I don't know if they even still have those, but that if you're old enough, you'll remember what those things were
Uh,
like.
oh my god.
I guess we're aging ourselves again, different ways. But yeah, I really loved that we got to see more of Clea and Luthen's backstory in these final episodes. And I was really struck, Alana, you actually shared this article with me about Sean Collins wrote an article in Decider. And there's a line in here that it really resonated with how I felt. Before, when first resisting to go to Yavin, Clea clearly also doesn't think that she deserved safety or peace or fellowship or companionship beyond Luthen, beyond that deep and intimate and also fraught relationship that they had with each other. And I just it really breaks my heart that that was happening, and I'm so glad that under the Rebel Alliance, under the leadership of folks like Mon Mothma, who we've talked about has exemplified a much more consistent moral and caring leadership. That is not that's a journey I'm glad she had on Yavin, but
Mm.
it is something I never want somebody in the movement to feel like that, that they don't belong. I want this to be a place where people and what we try to do our best with Get Free is like, this is a place where we don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We're here to treat each other with equal humanity. We're here to have some joy and fun amidst fighting as best we can to win. And this is a movement that should be a place where you can count on the people around you, where our passion for our cause translates into a real compassion for each other. And at the same time, allowing people to have lives outside of the movement. I know in this case on Yavin, they're stuck on a planet and they need to be on a secret base. But it's important for the movement to be a part of your life, not your entire life. It can't give you everything. And it shouldn't actually be the place where you get all of the nourishment you need as a human being. And that's why I love in this in this series that Mon Mothma also has that repeated mantra of like, we need to
Mm.
live, not just survive if we're gonna win.
Here, here.
When you're talking about relationships, I was thinking about eros, just like the love that people have, romance. In the relationship with Cyril and Dedra, it's more of a BDSM power exchange relationship. You don't really feel love. You feel dependence. You feel people pushing each other.
And that's not something I would want to say about other people's like safe,
I know.
safe,
We shouldn't
consensual
do this with people
BDSM
we know.
relationships.
We
No, no,
shouldn't
no.
do it with
I mean,
people.
I'm saying like I don't want it to sound like we're saying that like
Oh,
people
I'm not.
aren't in good
I have
relationships.
no
But
judgmentalism or pejorative
okay.
about
I
the
know you
real
don't.
world
I'm
stuff.
just letting our listeners know.
It's fair to say that. No, totally fair.
Okay.
But what I mean
Okay.
is that where in the real world, BDSM power exchange are elements of erotic like diversion that complement actual relationships between people that include many other dimensions. They're a feature, they are rarely like the whole thing. And if they are the whole thing, I'll be worried about them. In contrast, Bix and Cassian, they fuck. They wake up in bed together. They are thinking about each other with longing and yearning when they're not there. And I think there's a crucial element here about the way that right-wing authoritarian movements deal with sex and romance and eroticism and the eros. What they're trying to do is suppress it in its natural form so that you take that energy and move it to the power relationship that you have to obey and deal with: church, state, work, and so on. And that is such I've never seen a TV show make that point so clearly.
I want to throw in here, Natalie Green is a member of Get Free who was going to join us today, but at last minute was not able to. She had a really good insight on Dedra, which was just like, kneeling to the Empire will not save you from misogyny and loss. They will turn on you the moment you are no longer convenient. Like the way that Dedra was used as a scapegoat, including by the younger man who she basically professionally mentored until he got too big for his britches, and, like, he set her up to take the fall. She's still the only woman in those rooms, and yeah, first hang up pushed off the glass escalator, as it were,
The
first hang
glass
out to
cliff.
dry.
Yeah.
And the beauty, hate to say it, of her ending up on Narkina 5 Part 2, building the Death Star that she had accidentally sort of let slip through her carelessness. Like, let's talk yeah, I'd like your folks' reflections on her arc if you wanna, Anthony.
Oh, Dedra. Yeah, I mean, her fate is just a representation of the hierarchy of control that the Empire has. They have hierarchies based on race or species, they have hierarchies based on gender, and they need that. They need that to push people into these categories in order to justify a handful of people like the Emperor ruling over everyone else. And with Dedra, she has a moment a little late on Gorman and then elsewhere where you see some of the like humanity of her breaking through a bit of that like imperial armor that she's encased and been encased in. And yeah, it is really stark to like sit with how yeah, the only woman in that ISB room is the one who is put in prison at the end. The same place where she apparently started, right? She was a
Mhm.
child in a prison. And so that is just upsetting, of course, even though she did
Yeah.
so many evil things. It's sad to see this person. Like you see her in that room, that horrible place that we are very aware of, and see her just like sit in that. The other thing that I sit with Dedra, and it goes back to this quote that Tony, our friend Tony, may have drunkenly said last night,
God bless.
is this whole idea of how the people who enable fascism or advance fascism are the last ones to know that they're about to get fucked over.
Mhm,
Like,
mhm.
there are victims in the end on all sides. Authoritarians end up burning everything up to the center. And so that's what Tony lifted up last night. And you can see that with Dedra and Cyril as well. And yeah, in the Empire, the only person who's not disposable is the Emperor.
Yeah, like, I think a lot of times women who operate in those sorts of systems, they have a sense that they have somehow escaped the system by being so good at mastering it and not realizing like there is no, like if you're like playing by patriarchy, you are going to be subject to it. Yeah, like I'm not like other women. I actually, it's like, no, you're still just a woman to them. Like they will absolutely put you in that position because that is like they're bigots and that bigotry is going to apply to you. So all these people who think they're going to be the exception, it's like, no, they still look at you as less than. And she definitely saw herself as not being subjected that way, even though we see it from the outside. And I also thought at the end with Partagas, regardless of whether or not Partagas was listening to a broadcast of Nemec's manifesto, the fact that his or whether he was listening to a tape that he got out of, Luthen's house, the fact that the last thing is him in contrast to Nemec, I think, like, having him and Nemec kind of be the opposition to each other, you have the counter-espionage guy who's about manipulating the public through lies, and a young man who's, like, trying to speak the truth and broadcast the truth. It's like they're a really good contrast against each other. I also did note, though, when the Imperials are trying to figure out, like, what they're gonna tell when they broadcast Clea's picture on the HoloNet to actually get all the citizens to go and turn on her, rather than saying it's because she's a rebel spy, they go to try to malign her as being unclean and part of a dangerous social class. And what was interesting was that, like, the army faction is like, "Just tell them she's a criminal," but ISB, who is, as much as they fail at their social manipulation, still at least understands the value of doing it, is like, "No, people don't actually care about supporting us, but if you tell them that she's actually dangerous to them and is unclean, then maybe they will care." And he had this part of us had this smile on his face of saying, "I have once more proved my value." And he had. He had once more proved his value, but it isn't enough because you're not gonna be protected from the emperor, and they're gonna make you commit suicide, like, literally fall on your blaster rather than continue to be, a public failure on that front. I think it shows progress on how many people in Coruscant they could not rely on to be pro-empire, that he realized that saying, "Stop this young woman, she's a rebel," was not enough to get the public to help turn her in, that he had to give them some bullshit reason. Popping in with a quick correction, in this section, Charles is gonna mention Moff Tarkin, but he actually means Orson Krennic, as played by Ben Mendelsohn.
I was thinking about how in the comparison between Partagraz and Moff Tarkin is clearly a morally corrupt soul. Like he's the kind of person who will flout the laws of his own system if it suits him. Partagraz is a true believer who's dedicated himself heart and soul to the cause, not the cause we like, but nonetheless. And his decision to commit suicide, it's almost as it's not to escape consequences. It's almost like his final gift to the system to relieve it of having to deal with what happened. If I kill myself, you can just blame me and carry on and move forward. I love this system so much. I don't want to be an obstacle even when they come at me for bad reasons.
Oof, that's even sadder than what I originally thought. Thank you, Charles.
Uh, I also love the quote we got, when Clea and Luthen are debating how to respond to Lonnie, the true hero of our people, and Luthen says, "We've used up all the perfect," because she's concerned that this could be a trap. I think that's a good quote to reflect on if you wanna take that, Anthony.
Uh, Lonnie. I wanted Lonnie to live.
Mhm.
I am upset that Luthen apparently killed him in that moment. Yeah, no, I'm mad. Just
Yeah, you can be
Lonnie
just
should
mad.
still be with us.
Mhm.
And yes, that quote, I'm so glad that at the end, Luthen arrives at that letting go of perfect because rebellions, movements, it's all experimenting. We have to have a strategy and we have to have a North
Mm.
Star, and we have to have training and tools, but a lot of it's figuring out how we're going to get closer to the goal and letting go of the idea that everything has to be perfect and go our way because it's never going to be the case. And
Mhm.
when we do that, we actually allow ourselves to see that everyone around us has value and has a contribution and has a place to learn and to grow. And I think that at the end, Luthen, who, as Charles was mentioning before, can be in many ways so cutthroat and just like very focused on just getting a certain outcome at the end, regardless of what is the cost leading up to there. In that moment and in that episode, we finally see Luthen actually showing compassion and for Clea and for others, and also just having a bit more flexibility and
Mm.
really getting at the point of why they're in this fight in the first place, rather than focusing on how much and how perfectly he can hurt the enemy.
Well, I also think that the reveal that he had been an Imperial soldier speaks so much to his mindset, which is that, like, there are people who are going to be sacrificed and that he is equipped to make those decisions because that is still the Empire talking through him.
That's being a military officer, any kind of military officer.
Yeah. So it really combines in that way for him.
I appreciated him at the end. He took responsibility. And that's something
Mhm.
we rarely see in the modern world, but he knew luck was running out. He knew, like, this was all gonna end in a bang, and instead of making it someone else's problem, he took responsibility, and I thought that was beautiful, and it tempers his manipulativeness and willingness to use people. In his mind, it's like, "Yeah, I'll use people, but in the end, in the final analysis, I take responsibility for what I have to do."
Yeah, I just wish it hadn't involved shooting Lonnie, but other than that, yeah. But, like, with the scene with him and Dedra in the store was such a beautiful piece of cinema, and the moment when he turned his back to her, I was like, "Oh, he's acting. In case there's any chance that she hasn't figured it out, he's being like, 'I'm gonna turn my back to you because I really am gonna pretend like this is normal.'" And he's also turning his back to her because he's gonna get the plausible deniability weapon his way out. I mean, Lord knows if you've got to go, a crystal dagger is not the best use, like, that is a very brutal, difficult thing to pierce human flesh with. So, like, speaks to a level of mental fortitude, right? But him bringing her this dagger, this ornamental dagger, and being like, "We don't know what it's for sure," is sort of like a metaphor for him still saying, like, "Let's see what this scene is being about." And I just thought that was such a beautiful piece of filmmaking because I did a second, like, "Oh my god, he turned his back to her." Oh, right, he's like, he's they're still going through the dance, and then when it's clear, he's gonna have this confrontation, and he's also drawing out to take up as much time as he can for the mercury that he threw on the soundboard to finish dissolving everything so that it's not worth it for her. It was just an amazing showdown there. I also wanna talk about the hospital sequence. One, I love how much of the show perspective shifts to being Clea's for the last 3 episodes, because one of the most important things that this show is doing is saying that it isn't just about this one man as a solitary hero. There are multiple people who are part of the story, and now we have this whole window into Clea and her role in her past, and her scene in the hospital it is an amazing action hero sequence that's not predicated on her having superior physical strength. It's not predicated on her being a dead-eye shot. Like, she knows how to use a gun, but she's not Crosshair from, Bad Batch. She's just like a normal person who's gotten a gun once she gets there. She doesn't even show up with one, but who is using her social engineering knowledge, her ability to avoid detection, and her love to be able to break through. And I am struck by a few parallels in the hospital to the stuff we see in real life, including one, the doctor trying to keep the police away from the patients, which, like, we have seen now, we're dealing with confrontations between hospital and medical workers, church workers, people in schools, and students versus ICE, who are trying to take people who are under their protection away. And then when it gets to be the head of the hospital, while they do have to threaten him to get him to go along, under threat, he does go along. Under threat, the leader of the hospital is like, "Yeah, okay, you can shut everything down." But it is under a severe threat of, like, "We're basically gonna start killing your patients on the hospital if you don't let us do this."
Unfortunately, I guess I'll speak to this. Yeah. Yeah, I think in that moment it just showcased like the empire, fascists, white supremacists. They care about control. They care about their own power. They don't care about the lives of everyone else around them. They're
No.
willing in that moment for the sake of keeping somebody alive to torture. They're willing to sacrifice the lives and the well-being of everybody else, hundreds and thousands of people, in that hospital. And as you mentioned, it's so important at the same time for us as movements in real life to be pressuring these institutions and these leaders and providing them with the backbone to refuse to comply. Because ultimately, mass refusals to comply with the regime is the game in order for us to win in the end.
I was thinking about something I saw recently where there's a particular kind of person who will do things for you unasked, and then later on will try and demand things back from you, like spending time with them or attention or coming to something. And in what they're doing is they're engaged in a transactional relationship. And the initial things that they offer are actually, part of a sequence of manipulation where they're trying to get something back. And I'm looking at in the hospital scene, we see people who, in the whole show, we see people not understanding those dynamics. Authentic relationships are not transactional. When the hospital director was trying to protect his patients, he was not engaging in a transactional relationship. He wanted it to be about the thing itself, like his job and what he's supposed to care for. And the empire, the ISB, are saying, you don't understand. Everything is transactional. And we're now going to show you how you need to be transactional with us because we can crush you like a bug. And I think that is an implication of right-wing authoritarianism, to turn every relationship into a transactional one.
That's a really great point there. Any other thoughts about the Clea Luthen origins sequence that we want to go through?
I think Luthien, as a caregiver parent, was remiss in not addressing her obvious childhood trauma. He was sort of like a parent who says, wow, you've been through an awful experience. Let me use that to mold you into an accomplice for the rest of your life.
Oh,
As a
yeah.
father of a daughter, not my first choice when thinking about the well-being of another child, let alone my own. But that's Luthien for you. To be who he was, he had to get rid of all that extra baggage.
Yeah, I mean, he even says, "I'll only be your father when it's useful."
No, I think he put it to her when you wanted to, I thought he put it to her. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I thought he sort of actually put it on her to decide when and if he wanted that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I could see they were developing over the course of that time this like give and take dynamic as well. And I feel like that was even a bit towards it looked like it was like the planet of Naboo, but I don't know if it was. But the sequence where she wants to hit the detonator, she wants to be the
Yeah.
one who like makes the call and he doesn't let her. That's like the only moment, Charles, I feel like we get closer to like fatherly. He's like, this will really
Oh,
traumatize you if you're the one who like hits this button because you
right.
don't fully understand what you're gonna feel and the consequences yet. But yeah,
That's a good point. I
yeah,
like that.
it's confusing.
Luthen says to Dedra, "Freedom scares you." And she's like, "No, like you're just," she basically offers him a counter narrative that is truly believable to someone like her who is wrong. But her answer isn't like, she doesn't say, "No, work will make you free," or like quote some like other completely transparently evil Nazi thing. She's saying it's like, "No, people like you just want to see chaos and you don't care who you hurt." Like she's wrong, but like she's saying something that it can be persuasive to other people who are like her. And I loved his retort of, "The rebellion isn't just here anymore, it's flown away. There's a whole galaxy out there waiting to disgust you." And his framing of her as having disgust for freedom, I thought was it's a great line.
Well, there's something in the modern condition where we envy and have contempt for people who are too free. They flaunt
Mm.
our social norms, and it's threatening, and we also think it's gross, much of the time. And that's one of the lenses with which we can look at other people in other societies, is to see how it's affecting our sense of like what people should be allowed to do.
Oh, I like that. Anthony, do you have any thoughts about where Clea what exact Imperial battle situation it was that Clea and Luthen met at? I don't have a clue. I don't know if it might not be unclear, but if you did have any, do share.
It was pretty unclear to me. I just it looked like now my Star Wars expanded universe helmet on. In the timeline, it has to be probably towards the later part of the Bad Batch series. So it's like like 2 or 3 years, I bet, after Revenge of the Sith. So it's early Empire. And this is the time where the Empire starts recruiting and or conscripting mostly human beings from the galaxy to replace clone troopers. And they haven't figured out their armor and stuff like that yet. So I'm just like looking at all the visual cues and I'm like, oh yeah, they haven't really nailed the stormtrooper stuff in
Mm.
this. And there's a bunch, the crackdowns and genocides that the Empire commits starts on day one. It doesn't start nor end with Gorman and Alderaan. And so I'm just guessing that that's the timeline, but I don't have a better sense of where that battle is or what planet they're on.
Totally fine.
It made me think of how the original Star Wars, back when George Lucas was political, he knew he was modeling the Empire after the United States. The Death Star is modeled after like an American aircraft carrier, the Nimitz. The persecuted people were in certain ways meant to resemble the Viet Cong. And when we saw Luthen's interactions as a soldier for the Empire, he was showing us scenes of what counterinsurgency looks like. He was showing us scenes of what it looks like when the US military is getting rid of rebel-held strongholds. This is what the United States does in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Vietnam, and other countries. And it's always interesting to me to think about, do people get this? Are they going to understand that this is what our country is doing every few years or continuously all the time, and it's exactly as gross as what we're seeing in the screen right now?
Hear, hear. There's obviously some Star Wars fans who are like, "Get your politics out of my Star Wars," but I think there are really a lot of people who really do, like I see the discourse with people being like, "Hey, you guys know that he wrote this about the Vietnam War, right?" And I love that, like, the story is still so strong that it can continue to talk about what the world today, just as much as it was talking about things like World War II, and just talking about it speaks to, like, everything. I even saw a moment when they're breaking up the cobblestones on Gorman, I was like, "Beneath the paving stones, the beach," from, like, Paris, May '68. Like, there's so much history that we can see and read into that moment. I I want to jump back a bit to reflect on a tension that we see throughout the series, although particularly pronounced in Gorman, but not exclusively. What does it mean to say the whole world is watching or the whole galaxy is watching when you are not controlling the context of what they're seeing?
I'm sure many listeners or viewers have been at a protest where something like that is the slogan or thing that we're saying or repeating.
Like, I think every protest I've ever been at, and I'm old, like, has said that, yes.
But the it goes back to what we talked about earlier about strategy and taking actions that allow you to set the terms of the debate.
Mhm.
And in the case of the rallying and the protests on Gorman right before the massacre, the Gorman front is reacting. And in a way that is where they're not aligned, they're not necessarily united, and they are ignoring signs of walking into a trap. And in the cases for us, it's important what we say and the story that we're telling through the visuals and the words that we're saying at a protest. But it's also important for us to pick the time and place where we want to be setting that theater and advancing our cause. And that's not going to be every moment. We have to create our own centers of gravity, like we talked about before.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean just protesting, or it's not sustainable for us to just protest and do all those things at any given moment. Instead, we have to uh, be specific about what moments we think are going to actually bring us closer to winning. The whole theme of the show is like, let's, instead of just fighting, we should really be doing what's worth it and towards winning. And that means having a real plan and thinking about how every action you're taking is in service of that.
I love that Cassian says near the finale, "No one can do this alone." Like, it's like that was like the stand up and cheer part of the conversation. what do we want? I haven't talked about KS2, who is the giant killer robot that is liberated from its oppressive, violent programming and is now ally in the rebellion. K2 does not follow orders. When they leave the robot behind in the plane, K2 is like ultimately like, you know what? I'm following the signals of what's happening around me. The plan has gotten cracked up. I'm going to use my thinking and initiative. And he saves the day by not following orders. So, like, a robot literally saving the day by not following orders because he's observant about what's happening around him and being nimble is like a really great inversion of people's assumptions about, robots. There's so much rich subtext about, like, Star Wars has a droid problem in the sense that Star Wars sometimes can't decide if they're an oppressed people or if they're just robots or what exactly.
Right.
But I thought that the handling of KS2 in all of the Tony Gilroy related stuff is not alone in being solid. There are others too, but it's particularly solid.
I'm just gonna jump in and say it's the C-3PO of Andor, which is also a way of saying it's the Kramer of Andor. There's always a character who's there for comic relief. And I think it's very amusing and well done, the way that this murderous, dangerous robot plays that role.
Mhm.
And, it's interesting. If I lived in a world where robots or whatever you call them had the ability to have conversations, make jokes, be offended, gamble, I might start to see them as an oppressed class too.
Yeah.
And but we they never really explore that question, which I think would make sense in universe.
Well, for listeners or viewers, I definitely recommend reading the Dark Droids comic series that recently came out. It takes place right before Return of the Jedi, so I think it came out about a year ago, and it's a whole saga where the rebels and the Empire all have to deal with this droid contagion that is liberating all the droids from their programming, and they're fighting for independence.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
But it's
And mhm.
complicated, it's fraught, like,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
things about it are fraught.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. There are so many excellent Star Wars comics for folks who don't know. Like, there's just really great Star Wars comics. Um, I I also thought that it's telling that in a show that I think a lot of critics who don't love the show are like, "Oh, it's grim, it's dark," that Tony Gilroy cares enough about B2 to go and show us our adorable square robot toddler child is happy and safe in, like, the last scene of the series. Because, like, Tony Gilroy knows that droids are people too and knows that we have emotional investment in it, and he wouldn't do that if he wasn't, like, team droids are people too, you know? And I love Cassian, like, the first thing he does after he loses Bix in his life is, like, take on a droid as a companion to, like, help it become, a person with agency and friends and a social life, despite him having such direct trauma caused by droids that look exactly like that droid in his own life. Like, he would have been the first person to have a justifiable, immediate response of, "I don't know that I wanna be hanging out with this particular style of giant killer robot." He's like, "No, this giant killer robot is actually my best friend now."
Cassian is a man who matures out of his own programming and starts to write his
Mm.
own scripts. Because if it was his original programming, he would not have that relationship with that, particular droid robot. And it's like an example of how you achieve mastery as a person.
I do miss the best little boy, that little red square droid. I'm glad we got to see that he's happy at the end. I'm glad that we got to see Bix being happy and living, not just surviving her trauma in that moment. I understand that some fans are understandably critiquing how she's portrayed with her child at the end and that's the trope that sort of symbolizes. And I'm also happy if she's happy. And at the same time, I'm sad that we didn't get to see little red boy again in with Cassian.
But at least he gets to live with his other little robot friend in Bix. And I wanna say, like, I understand people's critique that, just because, someone is pregnant doesn't mean they have to leave the main narrative and her idea of, like, she's a distraction to Cassian, so she should leave. Like, I get the ways that's problematic, but I also wanna propose a different interpretation of it, which is that one, we know she gets to survive. She's holding a child who represents the future of a future who will continue to live despite what's been happening. Like, her standing in the wheat fields is really like, this is like future, this is like a futurist propaganda of like the glorious future that we'll get to experience post-revolution. But also, she's going back to the farm planet in which she has community ties. And who is to say that she is not there to help organize those farm workers to better resist the empire the next time the empire comes knocking? Like, who's to say that just because she's like, maybe I don't want to be on the base in which like people may or may not be getting, blown up depending what happens with what's happening with my baby. And also Cassian really was using her as an excuse to get out of the rebellion. Like, she did not want him to do that. But she's somewhere where she can make a difference herself through her knowledge, her skills, and her community. So, like, I don't know that that's why that was done, but I choose to feel like, oh, she's back on farm world to help the farm workers and raise her child.
That's my headcanon, and I'm excited for more big stories.
I mean, people have been asking, this is and I'll actually put this to the panel. One of the questions folks have been asking is like, what are the stories that you would love to have seen either in the side comics that will come out around the show? Knock on wood, there'll be something, and certainly one for me is when Cinta says it's been a rough year. I'm all like, and I would love to know what that was because whatever is about Cinta is always intriguing. So that would have been an interesting story to get fleshed out. What outside story would you commission, Anthony? And then I'll ask you, Charles.
Oof. We got that scene in the last episode when they're doing the montage of what's Mon Mothma's husband's name?
Oh,
It's
Perrin.
kind of funny. I don't
Perrin.
remember it.
Yeah, it's Perrin.
Perrin.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Perrin is drinking and maybe they're cheating on their
Oh,
well, maybe
yeah.
she's cheating on the other guy. Like, I think it's Mon Mothma's another relative or a good friend
No,
of
no, no.
hers.
It's the mother-in-law of their kid
Right.
from the party.
Right,
So it's
right.
it's the wealthy gangster whose family they just married into. That's the wife. So Perrin is
Right,
like
right.
potentially gonna get offed by like one of the wealthiest gangsters in the universe, or maybe he's fine with it because at least she's keeping it in the family. I don't know. But,
Yeah.
he did not get killed by the ISB is the thing. Which I'm assuming is maybe the
Yeah.
ISB is like has like a, some sort of listening device in case Mon Mothma loses her mind and calls home, which is not gonna happen. Um, but, it's I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I never really cared for Perrin, but
Yeah.
I do wanna know what happens with Mon Mothma's daughter,
Mm.
and I wanna see a future arc where they reunite. I'm hoping they both I mean, we know Mon Mothma survives. I hope that her daughter also survives the war, and I would love to see, like, a post like, in New Republic era reunion where Mon Mothma goes back to Coruscant, like, goes back to lead a New Republic Senate, and then is like,
Mm.
"Hello, daughter. Now we're on the other side of this."
I think I wish that some of the other storylines that appear, and especially Soul, like the really radical
Saw
faction,
Gerrera, yeah,
Saul
yeah.
Guerrero. Now he they do address it. I'm not saying there's no nuance in any of it, but it's kind of a caricature. It's kind of like, how you would draw out the crazy extremists for laughs and drama. But that's not all that world is.
Mhm.
How do people become that way? We see examples of his leadership. He has a big personality and he pushes people around. Okay, what's that like for the people he's pushing around? What's their incentive?
Mm.
Are they all people who just want to be dominated, or is it more like a joke internally, and you have to be an outsider not to see it? Those dynamics to me would be fascinating to explore.
There's definitely lots of Saw Gerrera material out there, and I don't know if any of it represents that sort of within his camp perspective, but I agree he's a fascinating character. I don't know, Anthony, if you're aware of any particular Saw external stuff that folks should check out.
I would want more of it too, like what Charles said. I think we've seen Saw Gerrera in Rebels. We know his origin in the Clone Wars, being trained by the Jedi to be a freedom fighter. We see him in Bad Batch briefly. We see him in the Jedi Fallen Order video game, where he helps the
Oh?
surviving Jedi at one point. Unfortunately, you see him sort of degrade over time, all the way up to Rogue One, where he's physically and emotionally and definitely this leadership a bit toxic.
Hmm.
But yeah, we don't really see how his band operates under his leadership and how people are pretty much shaped into accepting and being a part of that. One thing is we do see the aftermath of it. There's a really good, I think it's the main Star Wars line comics that focused on Luke and Leia, where after A New Hope, Luke goes back to the ruins of Jeddah and he meets up with some of the surviving partisans that were under Saw Gerrera and tries to recruit some of them into the Rebel Alliance and like have like a redemption thing with them, but they're all really traumatized. Anyway, that would probably be a
Hmm.
good story to read up on, but I
Yeah.
think we need more, like Charles said.
And just one last note about him. When I was thinking about his leadership style, he's a pirate captain. Yes,
Oh, yeah.
he's leading a rebel group, but the whole structure of his interaction with the people around him, he's a pirate captain, and it works.
Well, pirates had a lot of democracy internally, if they're during their golden age of piracy. Like, if you were a tyrant, like, the other guys would vote you off and kill you, and they'd have a new boss come in,
Mhm,
so,
mhm.
um, one thing that really struck me at the very end of this episode was seeing Bail Organa, the father of Princess Leia, is the guy who finally says in Andor, "May the Force be with you," and then we see Cassian accept that, blessing basically, despite his discomfort with faith for very legitimate reasons. Anyone want to reflect on that moment?
I've been a big Bale fan for a while, and I'm glad in this final arc we got to see more of him. That's another story I want. I want more Bail
Mm.
Organa in this era. And so him saying that we know he's been a friend of the Jedi for a long time, that he understands the connection with the Force. He's the father of Leia. And yeah, what you said about Cassian's understandable skepticism of faith and taking up mantles of leadership. I just think that bringing that in, not only does it connect it to the rest of Star Wars, where there's not a lot of sort of the mysticism and magic and Force stuff in this show compared to everything else, but I think it really speaks. I think in a way, may the Force be with you. Like the Force is in this show is replaced by the actual words of hope and faith. It's like belief that we believe that we will win because we did before, we can now, and because of that, we can do it again. And so I think that that is really what's embodied with those two characters who we know are going to shortly be killed after that meeting, but we know in the end that the movement does win. And so I think that's what's carried on in that saying.
Both of their kids carry on, you know?
I like the decision that was made to reduce the Force romance stuff to an absolute minimum. I think that was smart, and I applaud it. And I was also thinking about how in the first Star Wars movies, the way the Force is used is to say the Empire is evil and atheistic. The Force is religion as a force for good in the world. And how could it be otherwise? Because they're so noble and magical. Well, in Andor, we understand that that religion itself can be used in all directions. It can play all the different roles, and it matters what you do with it more so than the essence of it itself. And I think
Mm.
that in the end, when Cassian is sort of seems to be less antagonistic, I think that's him reflecting that his earlier aversion to it is as problematic as being completely immersed in it, and that the right way is to case by case, see whether it's serving the cause or not.
I like that. So, we'll leave our listeners with what are some messages from the series that movement organizers should be taking away? We have talked about that throughout, and we have hit that before. But if there's something that we haven't had space for that you want to shout out, let's do that, Anthony.
Yeah, we've hit on a bunch of them, and I'm really glad that Charles is here to share some additional lessons we haven't even touched on in the last podcast. And for those of you who have not yet read any of our Nemix weekly manifestos, every week, including this week, we touch on key movement lessons. The Project Fulcrum team is going to get into writing right after this podcast recording. And so definitely encourage you to jump in there. I think I'm trying to think and hold on to one of the top lessons here. I think one thing that I want to pull back out that we talked about in one of our recent manifestos is the idea of owning our role. In the Rebel Alliance and in real life, we see different cells and different groups trying to play their part. We also see Mon Mothma and Bail Organa trying to hold the inside game while coordinating with folks who have to be fighting on the outside and are doing things they cannot do. And I think we just have to really hold on to and be both humble, but also be grounded in that while we're keeping our eyes on the prize, we should recognize that we're one part of the larger movement. And each of us have our own unique roles and contributions for creating positive change. We
Hmm.
want to be as best aligned on strategy and what that North Star is and what the plan is. But each of us and each of our groups really just have to get good at taking on and biting that right size bite of the apple rather than having to do everything in this, because we see what that can do when Luthen is drowning alone. But together as the Alliance, each of them can take on different forms of leadership to carry the cause forward.
I love it.
My lesson I hope folks get is that being an activist or an organizer can feel like you joined a subculture that is the right subculture, that is the good subculture. And then it becomes your personality and your identity, and everything flows from that. By mixing that with another subculture, the Star Wars fandom universe, I think it sends a kind of meta message that you really shouldn't ever restrict yourself to one subculture. That your strength is your ability to go back and forth between things that have a grounding in other people's worlds. There's a kind of activist that's always trying to pull you into their world. It's a nice world being an activist, but that's not what other people are thinking about all the time. It's not what their life looks like, and it never will be. People who care too much about politics are inevitably the minority in every society and in every age. So learning how to kind of be a little loosey goosey and entertain with stuff, mix it up with other worlds, including
Mhm.
fandom. That is the way to go. And I have so much appreciation to Anthony and the crew for doing this in a way that feels authentic to both parts of that equation.
Here, here. Like being able to work with Get Free on Nemec's manifesto and Project Fulcrum at large has just been such a highlight of the decade plus that I've been working on trying to get movements to consider engaging in popular culture, since that's where most of us spend a lot of our time. And he reached out to me about working on this stuff together. And it just means so much to be able to actually make it a reality. And, to our listeners, like, I want you to think about, if you're listening to this, you maybe you're like a Star Wars casual, but you're a hardcore in the MCU stuff. Maybe you're hardcore in indie comics. Like, what are the spaces in which you have community and family and love, and how are you gonna also be able to, while spending time and enjoying those spaces, also think about making sure that the people who you spend time with in those spaces are also informed about the things they need to know and hear about, and, helping to connect them with movements for social change in the real world. So tell us, Anthony, how can our listeners stay involved with, Get Free with Project Fulcrum?
Yeah. So if you are listening right now or you're watching us on some split video of this on TikTok or something like that, you can join our efforts. You can be a part of the fight. You can become a fulcrum like us, like many folks have, just like you or different from you, but who share our values of freedom and equality and share our love of Andor and Star Wars. You can join us by signing up at bit.ly/Project Fulcrum, so capital P and capital F, or you can go to getfreetogether.org and you can find our page on there to sign up for Project Fulcrum. And if you go to any of our social media platforms at getfree lower space MVMT, you can click the link in bio and it will get you straight there. So by joining us, you'll be a part of a large Discord community where we have hundreds of fans who are part of this fight now and who will be carrying the torch forward in the coming weeks and months ahead after this season finale. And you'll also get on our email list to get those weekly calls to action.
Yeah, like real, meaningful, accessible things you can do in your life that are not scary, are welcoming and meaningful, that you can do through Get Free. Charles, where can our listeners keep up with where are you active on social these days?
I've actually been pretty shrouded in darkness this last bunch of time, and we'll just make it more difficult for people to follow me.
Fair enough. That means you all have to go follow Get Free. As for me, I spend way too much time on Blue Sky at LEVIN on Blue Sky and Graphic Policy Radio. We cover the intersection of comics and movements for social change, other kinds of sci-fi nerd media. I know I'll be covering the Daredevil series very soon, the Daredevil TV series. So I'd love to have folks stay in touch for that. Yes, because I know that they wrote that to be about Trump, but clearly Daredevil is also about Andrew Cuomo and his attempt to return to power in New York, just as explicitly. Anyway, and Get Free has been doing amazing work keeping New York residents aware of mayoral candidates' stances, in fact, doing lots of education for New Yorkers. So I want to say to our listeners, may the force be with you, and please subscribe, and share.